Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about computerizing the sense of smell and what olfactory technology might be able to achieve in the future. We've made huge strides with the senses of sight and hearing. We can capture pictures and sounds by mechanical means, store them in digital form on computers, and reproduce them at will. We cannot yet do that with aromas, but my two guests are working on the problem. Chris Hanson is the founder of a company called Aromyx, which started in 2006, and which is a leader in the field of olfactory science. Chris has been involved with early-stage technologies for over 20 years and has a successful track record of bringing new technologies to market. Luke Schneider is on the board of directors of Aromyx and is also the founder and chief scientific officer of Target Discovery Incorporated, a cancer diagnostics company. Previously, Luke did extensive work in inhalation therapy at SRI International, and some of the biological models he created are part of the Aromyx technology. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Great to have you here today.
Thank you, Marty.
Chris, let me start with you. You're the founder and president of Aromyx. What is Aromyx actually working on? What products are you trying to produce?
Well, we're producing a platform and a disposable biochip that essentially captures the human sense of smell and taste, and we're using that for customers in the consumer packaged goods, food and beverage industries that want a scientific way to analyze and design new aromas and flavors.
So this chip can sense aromas and then record them?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It does it much the same way the human nose and tongue do, because we use the same biochemical stack from the nose and tongue. We found a way to get that onto a chip. And the really fascinating thing is we show the same biochemical signals that your nose and your tongue would send to the brain.
Now, is the chip attached to something? Where does it record the information?
Yeah, we have a sensor body that goes along with it, and it basically plugs into a laptop through a USB connection.
Does it have a better sense of smell than the actual human nose? Why can't a human do that?
Well, humans do. Our skulls, frankly, get in the way of seeing the biochemical signals. And so, you know, companies in the food and beverage industry, for example, really want to see the signals that go to the consumer brain when you consume a cup of Starbucks coffee or eat some Kraft macaroni and cheese. They haven't been able to see that with humans, so we show them a way to get at those signals.
So these companies want to know if their food products smell the way they should?
That's one use, so that they adhere to the brand, you know, so the Kraft macaroni and cheese, every box of it tastes like Kraft macaroni and cheese is supposed to. There's probably more interest in using this to design new products or redesign existing products.
Yeah, in the industry, there's roughly 30,000 flavors and fragrances that are used in consumer packaged good products. And over the next 3 years, they estimate 10,000 of those are going to disappear, either because they're over harvested, like vanilla. They're being sourced from regions that are in war-torn strife, so they can't get it.
So you can't get the materials.
You can't get the materials, or internet rumors start and people refuse to use them anymore, or they're just ruled off of formulary because they've now discovered with better science that they're actually carcinogens or teratogens or are bad for you.
Well, are you looking to create artificial smells like we have artificial flavors?
I think that's a secondary use. What the real problem is, if you lose the ingredients or a core ingredient in something like Old Spice, an old established brand, makes a lot of money, but now you can't make it. How do you make it smell the same if you lose one of those key odor ingredients? They know experimentally they can mix things together, trial and error for years, trying to discover a way to mimic it. We give them a device that allows them to digitally record the current scent and then mix and match products in a computer to mimic that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the sense of smell itself, because this is something I'm interested in. We have some slides. Can we see the first slide, please? All right, so the text is probably a little small to read, but that's basically molecules touching on scent receptors, looks like.
Yeah, that's a schematic essentially of the nose. So you have what's called a main olfactory epithelium, which is a collection of neurons inside the nose in a little pad up in your sinuses. And when you inhale, the volatile odor chemicals go into your nose, and they go through the mucous membrane and find a receptor that they bind to. Each neuron in this little pad has a different receptor protein, and the olfactory chemical will bind to one but not bind to another. And it's the pattern that it triggers that your brain then interprets as orange. So, you know, your mother, you smell something as a child, your mother says this is an orange, you learn to associate that pattern in your brain with the orange.
And you basically want to mimic this functionality by mechanical means?
We want to do this, the same basic biochemistry, but do it in a chip that we can record that digitally, get the same answer every time. When you go, what typically is done now is you go to a focus group and they can tell you, well, if you've never smelled an orange, how do you describe in words to somebody what an orange is? Okay, it's very difficult. We can do that as a digital representation.
Now, one of the questions I have is whether there's such a thing like primary aromas, like primary colors, so that like every scent can be represented as some combination of the primaries. In fact, we have another slide which illustrates that. Can we see that slide? Okay,
yeah.
So is that indicating some primary sense and then subsense?
Yeah, this was actually developed by Ann Noble at UC Davis. And it's the aroma wheel for wines. So this is what they use in the enology program at Davis. So when you talk to a wine connoisseur, they'll describe a wine as grassy or earth tones or nutty. So there's roughly, the guess is somewhere between 13 to 25 primary odors, and probably a range of maybe 60 to 90 secondary odors around that. You can go out to tertiary.
So we're not sure.
We're not sure how many dimensions that space has right now, because we have no way to measure it like you do with color. Color is a four-dimensional space, but odor, we have an internal bet of how many dimensions the odor space is.
Well, speaking of the odor space, we have another slide which illustrates that. So let's take a look at that and see what we can learn from that. So this is an odor graph formulation. So what are we looking at here?
Well, the idea is the main picture that all the arrows point to. That is, let's say, Old Spice, to go back to the Old Spice example. That's Old Spice today. You're losing some of those ingredients, so now we have to find other ingredients that we've measured with the chip. So think of that, the X and Y axis on the bottom of the graph as the different receptor proteins that are on this chip. So they're positioned out on an array. And then the height of the bar is the amount of excitation of that receptor that you're measuring. So that's our quantitative measure. Now, by knowing what the odor is we're trying to mimic, we can look at the space of all the other odors that we can combine to mimic that primary that we'd like to match.
Now, does the chip generate that automatically? So if the chip senses an aroma, it generates this graph without your having to create it by hand?
It's literally a measurement, just like you're taking a photograph of something, and the photograph reproduces what the camera sees or what the eye sees. This is the same thing, it's just reproducing exactly what the nose would smell.
And just to make the sense of smell, make it have a little more sense, we have another graph which is sort of analogous to a color space, which, let's take a look at this. So this is a color space, but it's sort of analogous, I guess, to the sense of smell.
Yeah, I actually used to work my former life at DuPont, and DuPont invented color space. They invented something called the dew color machine. If you go to any paint supply place now, they'll measure anything you want to match, and the computer will determine what blend to use to match that color. In your printer, your computer printer, it's the same thing. It's CMYK or RGB. It's a four-dimensional space for color.
Now, is one of the goals to generate aromas? So, for example, you would be able to generate the smell of an orange without needing an actual orange.
That's the goal. So the idea is we can mimic other things. Ultimately, we can mimic other things with generally recognized as safe combinations of chemicals.
Now, could these chemicals be generated in the lab? Or would you have the problem of, well, maybe we'll run out of this chemical, so we can't generate this aroma?
A lot of chemicals are now generated in the lab, so they've been isolated from nature, determined what they structurally are, and people have figured, like vanillin, they figured out how to make the primary odor of vanilla. But there are secondary traits in all natural products that they've been unable to mimic. Since we can measure it, we now can start to mimic some of those things.
Let's talk about some of the possible uses. Let's say that you master this technology and you can record aromas, play them back at will, or maybe even have an aroma editor where you can put aromas in any combination. How would that be useful? What would be some of the main uses of that?
Well, initially what we're working on first is, as I said, a platform for use in the food and beverage and consumer packaged goods industries. So companies can design new perfumes, new wines, or redesign as needed. There are a number of other areas we think this can be useful. You know, it's never been done before. You've never been able to take a snapshot of an aroma. You can get the list of ingredients, but you can't record what the aroma actually is. So we think it's a kind of fundamental technology, like inventing a camera or a phonograph.
Yeah, when the phonograph was invented, it was a voice recording device. That was the intended use. Was like an answering machine, but they didn't have a telephone. So it's the same kind of, you don't know what's going to come from this, but you can imagine a lot of things. One of the things you can imagine is, I remember growing up my grandmother's date nut cookies. Okay, I remember that, but how do I transmit that to the next generation? If I could have recorded that along with her picture, I could then reproduce it for my children. Okay, or I could reproduce it in real life if I had an emitter device, so that if I want to remember my grandmother and look at her pictures, I can evoke that smell that I remember.
I've heard that there might be a lot of medical uses for this, like medical diagnostics. I've heard that dogs can sniff out certain cancer cells. A dog can diagnose you for some types of cancers, some dogs. Is that a possibility that you'll be able to use equipment to diagnose a person's illness non-invasively just by sensing what's in their breath, for example?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples there. You talk about dogs. It's been clinically proven in clinical studies that, yes, they can detect cancer and they can detect other things like diabetes. In principle, we can use our device for those same types of things. There's a researcher in New Zealand that I know about who's diagnosing tuberculosis and pneumococcal pneumonia based on the off gases, the volatile off gases that are coming off people's breath. And it's a wonderful technology to go into the third world with, where you can't use conventional approaches that we use here because you don't have the refrigeration, you have large equipment to lug around in the bush. So this is potentially a wonderful breakthrough technology in those areas.
How sensitive can you make the sensors? To sniff out a disease in a person, you would need a nose a lot more sensitive than a human nose, for example. Could you make a sensor that would be better than a dog?
Well, actually, a lot of old-time GPs, general practitioners, do use the sniff test, and they can detect ketosis and some diseases with experience. But dogs are very sensitive, so we would use our basic platform, but instead of using the human olfactory complex, we'd probably go with the dog or mouse, something more sensitive. I think dogs have something like 1,000 different receptors, unique receptors, instead of the 350, 360 that humans do.
Yeah, the real advantage of our technology over what people have done conventionally, which are mass specs and liquid chromatographs and the typical analytical instrumentation, is sensitivity. We gain about 4 to 6 orders of magnitude in sensitivity over any man-made sensor for chemicals. And it's because your natural olfactory complex has an amplification step, actually has 2 amplification steps. Because we use those biochemicals in our chip, we get the same level of amplification in the chip. So we can sense things up to six orders of magnitude more sensitive than any other technique.
I imagine that there are also military uses, sniffing out explosives, for example.
Yeah, there are, and in fact, this technology has had a great deal of U.S. government funding that's gone into it, primarily from Department of Defense, from DARPA, and from some other government agencies. And so the initial impetus was exactly that, using the technology to detect sarin, nerve agent, mustard gas, TNT, and other explosives and contraband items.
Maybe it could be used offensively also, say for crowd control, where you have an overpowering odor which doesn't kill you, but it makes you want to leave the area right away.
There was a proposal I wrote a while ago that I felt like I had to take a shower afterwards, but think of it in terms of if I'm an Iraqi, I'm used to certain odors that I grew up with. A U.S. Army checkpoint doesn't have those odors. It has Old Spice, pizza, and beer. 3 things I've never experienced in my life. So how do I make a U.S. checkpoint or a U.S. embassy smell more like an Iraqi neighborhood on a calm night? And this technology potentially can do that kind of thing.
So you can record smells theoretically and then play them back.
And then try to mask the odors in a given area and play it back.
You see this in, already you see this in corporate, in retail settings. A lot of retail stores like Macy's or Nordstrom's will kind of mold the aromascape that you're in. And certainly casinos are probably the best at this.
Well, perfume's a very big business. Will we have customizable perfumes that you just whip up on your computer at home?
That is entirely possible. One of the, if you look at the growth of internet advertising, one of the things you cannot advertise over the internet or even over the television is food odors. What's it worth to Pizza Hut to have the scent of a freshly baked pizza come across your TV set at 6 o'clock at night? It's priceless.
So the TV, of course, would have to be manufactured to be able to do that.
Very easy to add those kinds of things on, just like you add, it would be in the carrier signal, and obviously there's a market to be tapped there, but just like you add the sound to a television, you can add an odor track to the television.
I remember in the past in the movies there were some experiments with smell-o-vision where you try to have authentic smells of what was happening in the movie. I don't think it was a big commercial success, but all
the attempts we've seen in this space are pretty sparse on underlying science. And so the example you're giving, I think I remember that too. They would give you a card to, at a certain point in the movie, you scratched a panel and it smelled like chocolate or like gunpowder. Very crude. So, what we're talking about is you would have a peripheral, much like an inkjet printer. Instead of rows of ink cartridges, you'd have the necessary basic odor reagents, primaries. As Luke said, we have a bet on the team. We think it's between 13 and 15 that make up pretty much all the odors. And so that that kind of technology exists. The inkjet technology exists to create the odor in your home.
Well, what are some of the hardest problems you have to solve to advance this technology? What are some of the difficulties you face getting this to market?
The biggest issue is probably that we're dealing with biologics. You look at the cost of biological drugs, protein drugs. They're very expensive compared to the small chemical drug. Anytime you're using a biologic in a sensor, you have new problems. Cost in the consumer market is clearly a driver. If you're going to be using this as and it's designed as a disposable, like the old Kodak film or Polaroid film, to use once, throw it away. And if you want people to adopt it, it's got to be a low cost at a consumer level. So trying to take diagnostic or medical use type technology and push it down to the consumer level, cost is a major concern. Most of that cost is making the biologic, and to do that we have to clone human genes into yeast and grow the yeast. So we've licensed in technology that makes that cost effective.
So you're starting with some human cells scraped off of some part of a person, and
we take the DNA out that codes for the proteins for the olfactory receptors, and we clone those into yeast, and there are good reasons for using yeast, but deeper than we want to go into here.
Is this a field that's getting crowded? Do you have competitors, or do you have the field pretty much to yourself at this point?
Well, we do have competitors, and we would worry if there were none. But the real difference is that what is offered today is offered as a lab service. So there are a couple of companies that do use olfactory sciences, but the customer has to come to them, give them the assignment, and they do it at their own premises as a lab service, and they get very involved because of that in the customer's internal business and secrets. What we're doing is packaging this technology as a portable technology, so if Procter & Gamble wants to take it behind their firewall and not tell us what they're doing, that's fine.
What about therapeutic uses? So for example, if you're in the hospital, you'll probably have less stress if your hospital room smells like roses than some of the other things that you might smell in a hospital.
Yeah, there's actually a great study in the prisons in, I think it's Holland? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was Holland. Where just wafting the smell of orange through the HVAC system of the prison, they've reduced their violent incidents 50% month to month. And they reduce the need for medication for the prisoners, psychiatric medication for the prisoners, 10%.
Because people spend enormous amounts of money on antidepressants and all these things to feel better. Maybe if they could just fill their house with the right smells, they'd get equal results.
Could be.
So what do you see as the ultimate direction of this technology? Do you think that the average person will really feel the effect of this in coming years?
That's clearly our goal. I can imagine this would be incorporated into digital cameras. It'll be incorporated into television studios. The genesis of this idea is I like to cook. I like to watch the food channel, and I just happened to look up from what I was working on when the chef was going, I wish you could smell this at home. I think I can do that.
I've heard there's also a connection between smell and memory. Certain smells are evocative of certain memories. Like you smell something in your childhood, and if you smell it again today, it'll instantly bring that up.
Yes.
Can that be leveraged for practical purposes?
The interesting thing in the first graph you showed, the neurons that go from the olfactory receptor into your brain, they actually go to the oldest part of your brain, whereas all your other senses get filtered by the higher level of your brain first. So you're triggering what is often referred to as the lizard brain with smell. So it's very emotional, very low level response in the brain. And yeah, it's one of the biggest triggers for memory.
Now, what are some of the sensitivity limits? Is there any theoretical limit as to how sensitive these chips can be?
Well, Luke has designed essentially a gain control on this. Luke did some of the original mathematics and understanding of how essentially gain in olfaction works.
Yeah, what I like to describe, it's a 3-protein system called G protein coupled receptors. There's the receptor, which I like to think of as the guitar in a rock band analogy. That's what responds. You pluck the right receptor or the right string on the guitar, you get a certain note. There's a pickup on that guitar, and it gets taken through and it comes out in a speaker. And that's the 3rd protein in the system, which amplifies the signal. So you get lots of copies of an internal molecule inside the cell for that one binding event or the one pluck of the string. And so the cell can now hear it. In between those 2 proteins is a protein called a G protein. And I like to describe that as the amplifier. And the mathematics that I did understanding this system was first elucidated by Richard Axel and Linda Buck. They won the Nobel Prize in the 2004, I think, for this. So they were the ones who first put it together. It's how all the human senses work. It's how all mammalian senses work. But the G protein is like the amplifier, and what I figured out was how to turn the gain up and down. So you can imagine now that yes, we can turn the gain way up on that amplifier with some chemical tricks, and you can imagine the Back to the Future movie where he blows out that giant speaker.
Well, it sounds like it has great potential, and I wish you all the best of luck with it. We are out of time, so we're going to have to wrap. I've been speaking with my guests, Chris Hanson of Aromyx Technology, the founder and president, also Luke Schneider, board member of Aromyx, also founder of
Target Discovery.
Sorry about that. This is Marty Wasserman. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, see you next week.